Hello. This video is going to be split into two parts, and even so it's going to end up being quite long. It's an interview with Professor Duncan Sayer, who I call Dr. Duncan Sayer in the interview, but he's Professor Duncan Sayer, about a book he released at the end of last year about early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, which there's a picture of on screen at the moment. And he's asked me to point out that it's available for free on the Manchester University Press website, which UCLan put a lot of money and effort into securing, so by all means take advantage of that. And before we start, there's an unrelated thing which my university is doing involving Dr. David Robinson and some of his colleagues, which is about the use of hallucinogens by Indigenous Americans in California. So that's an online talk this coming Wednesday, the 17th, and that may be a different day depending on your time zone. So there's a link and more information in the description, and also a link to Duncan's book. So thank you very much indeed for watching, and here we go. So this is one of my lecturers at the University of Central Lancashire, Dr. Duncan Sayer, who's very kindly agreed to talk a bit about his new book, which was published at the end of last year, and it's Early Anglo-Saxon Cemeteries. I'll put a link in the description under the video. And it uses a combination of spatial analysis and other techniques to analyse early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, and it goes through a nice sort of symbolic progression of chapters, from the syntax of graves to the metre and the grammar and things like that. So thank you very much indeed for agreeing to talk. Would you like to go through a bit about what the book's about and how the methods have been applied and things like that? Or
yeah, thanks, Simon. Okay, so the book, as you said, so the book is called Early Anglo-Saxon Cemeteries, if you can see that. Early Anglo-Saxon Cemeteries, Kinship, Community and Identity. Okay, and so the idea was to review the archaeological evidence for early Anglo-Saxon mortuary practice using a sort of holistic and multi-dimensional perspective. So we wanted to include, or I wanted to include, as much different evidence as possible to draw in and create a sort of cohesive and site-specific discussion. There are a number of images in it that sort of highlight sort of useful in various ways, but what I would like to do is just share one with you, well, two, I guess, actually, one slide with you, and sort of start from that perspective, really. So this is the so here's the slide. Can you see that yet?
hang on, let me see. I think that, yeah, that's come up, yeah.
Yeah, so this is the slide I want to share. And it contains two images that I made a few years after excavating at Oakington Early Anglo-Saxon Cemetery, which is a project that we ran here at UCLan in collaboration with Manchester Metropolitan University and with Oxford Archaeology East. And we took students and we excavated over a series of about 5 years the cemetery site. And it was sort of really a completely different perspective. I've been studying early Anglo-Saxon cemeteries for decades, and actually going out there and excavating them was really sort of transformative in terms of the view. And so I sort of put these together as a bit of fun, really, but I ended up putting them in the book because they are they sort of illustrate a point I wanted to make. So what we've got on the left-hand side is a group of students surrounding one of the skeletons, one of the graves being excavated. And what I've done is superimpose some sort of objects onto that to try and add an Anglo-Saxon flavour to it, an early Anglo-Saxon flavour to it. So you've got Kayla in the background there, sort of supervising the excavation, and what she's doing is sort of instructing the other students about how to proceed. We ran the project in a sort of training way. So rather than having a single individual excavating each skeleton, we want to give people the experience of working on them and the confidence. They worked in teams on the site, on a single grave, and surrounded that. This is actually a double grave. You can see, I think, the legs of one individual here and the legs of another individual here. And they're in the process of excavating it. But what I thought as well, in reality, the only other time that people got as close to those intertwined bodies as the archaeologists did by kneeling down in there, by almost climbing into the grave itself. Certainly, limbs intertwining with the bodies in the graves, and the artifacts really, physically associated with them, was when it was laid out. And we tend to, when we draw reconstruction pictures, we tend to draw them in a very sort of Anglican way. So people stood rigid apart, looking onto a grave that's in front of them without interacting with it. But in reality, it's going to look much more like these images. We've got collaborations of people constructing an event, and those people have got particular types of knowledge or particular types of experiences that are structured by their role within the mortuary rite, and that itself is structured by their role within society, the relationship they had with the deceased, the relationship they had with everybody else present. And because of that, every single grave is different, because the people who attended the mortuary rite, the funeral, are all different to they were the previous time and the previous time and the previous time. And it's not just simply that there are more people coming from different places or less people coming from different places. It's also about how those people participated from the immediate community, immediate relatives or friends or householders who are making those choices and structuring the burials. So in this case, what we've got on the right-hand side is a much more elaborate scene. We've got multiple partners in a mortuary ritual. Again, it's an excavation. This is actually the cow lady with the cow yet to be revealed. Because I think it was the point where we just see the spine starting to appear the other side of the skull. And in this one, what I wanted to do was sort of highlight that multiple different roles type phenomenon. So again, in the foreground, we've got a small group of archaeologists, students, who are physically interacting with the grave and its objects and its participants. Just on the right-hand side there is Faye Sayer, my sister-in-law, who's a co-director of the site from MMU. So she's sort of directing that. So her experience of directing that and instructing the students about what to do is different from the students' perspectives. And she has much more autonomy about how that process would work. Just as someone who's directing the laying out of the burial, for example, Kayla or Faye in those contexts, would have much more control over what was going into the grave, how the body was positioned, how the limbs interacted, and that sort of stuff. Okay. And then in the sort of middle ground there, we've got these three individuals stood looking on. And those are much more like their sort of Anglican reconstructions, aren't they? We've got three individuals who are stood slightly apart, but sort of communicating in different ways. The first one is Amy. She was one of our students, and she's giving a tour basically to members of the public. But just in this way, you might have Amy telling a story to visitors from outside, and their experience, their interaction with the mortuary ritual, with the burial, is very different to that of the archaeologists or of the people who are laying out the body and putting artifacts, because they're not physically choosing what goes in the grave. They are listening to stories and maybe contributing some things, but not really constructing the rite. In a different one, if they attended, they may have a much greater role, and it will be influenced therefore by it. In the background here, we've got four individuals, two of them crouched down, who I've described in the blurb in the book as sort of sorting through the soil to prepare the mound that goes on top of it. So to sort of highlight the fact there are multiple different layers in the preparation of a grave. So you're cutting a grave, you're putting a person into it, you're carrying them from somewhere else where the body's been prepared, and then you're laying them out along with the artifacts, along with all the people's interactions and the viewing and the coming to visit. And there's also that sort of closing off aspects of the ritual as well, where they're sorting the soil to put onto the mound, the back. And behind them we've got Richard Mortimer, who is slaughtering a pig for the feast associated with it, because it's, again, this is a group of people, and so there may be feasting activities and other social events surrounding a mortuary ritual. I did that deliberately because Richard Mortimer is a slightly militant vegetarian, so I thought it'd be quite fun to have him slaughtering a pig. It's sort of really to highlight the sort of bloody noisiness of this as well. You know, the thing that strikes me most about archaeological museum reconstructions is that they're often completely clean, almost like a Hollywood movie. All of their clothes are beautifully clean. And yet actually these are noisy, smelly, dirty events. You know, there'd be kids running around and soil everywhere, and you know, it might even be raining, and you know, all this kind of stuff. And if animals are being slaughtered, then there's mess. I mean, perhaps you wouldn't necessarily slaughter the pig the day you're going to kill it. The day you're going to eat it, you may hang it, or you know, there may be other processes of preparation involved. But the point is, there's a sort of long way into these things. They take a while to prepare, to think about, and they have multiple phases and steps. And then standing next to him is my father, holding a spear, which I think is quite fun. I just gave it to him. He was there, and it made sense to give him a spear, given the stance he had. I dropped a house in the background to show the proximity of the actual settlement, and then people looking on from that space. Okay, so really what I wanted to do with these things is show different types of participation and then different layers of participation and activity within the space. And really those two pictures sort of highlight what I was trying to do with the book. If I just stop sharing screen there. So has that gone away?
It has.
Brilliant. Okay, so what I was trying to do is to really think about Anglo-Saxon cemeteries as lived spaces, as spaces that are continually returned to tell stories in, to remember events, not just the people. You know, while you're preparing one funeral, you might be talking about another funeral in great detail. The last one you attended, when we did XXX's funeral, we did this and this and this. Why don't we do that this time? Or da 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 da. And all of those things are sort of coming together to create the archaeological record, which is what we then see. And we don't really have much idea of who is behind all of this. Okay, there's that great mantra, the dead don't bury themselves. But that obvious question there is, well, who did then? And we have to understand, I think, that sort of hugely complicated agency, social agency that comes together from the sort of social context, the generational context, the settlement and multiple partners in there. And I think what we can really see is something attitudes that come through. So the way that I achieved that in the book is by sort of having a multi-layered approach to its structure. So let's have a look. And as Simon has already said, there are a series of chapters starting off with negotiating early Anglo-Saxon cemetery space, which is an introduction, which very much does what I've just done with a few examples, tries to tell a story, starting off with a double burial and describing it in detail and the interaction of people and how they get into it and how it's laid out and what those sort of secrets of knowledge might bring. So, for example, in that burial, someone's hand is closed around the objects, and only the people who closed that hand around the objects would have known that they were there, just as in that first example I just showed you, where, you know, those four girls crouched around the burial will know the intimate details of where all the objects are laid, where the body is laid out, how the clothing is laid out, whereas the people stood back and participating in a different way wouldn't be aware of that. So they have a knowledge that binds them together socially, okay, and a shared memory of something that creates a sort of a shared experience, you know, creating friendships, creating social bonds after the death of someone. So that's sort of the starting point for it, really. Okay, and then run through a series of examples to show how it fits together. And then the syntax of cemetery space, where we're looking at the physical structure itself. So, for example, the presence of barrows, the orientation of graves, the presence of older monuments that's helped to structure or not the mortuary space, and then the sort of individual stories of each cemetery. And one of the things I was trying to pick up on that really was to say, you know, it might be that people are using orientation to organise burial space, east-west, north-south, separating two different types of burials. Or it might be that they're using the physical space itself, one group of burials to the north, one group of burials to the south, separated by some distance of several meters, and obviously creating visual different spaces. It might be that people are using cremations or inhumations to separate and distinguish different groups within the cemetery. but they are still using some sort of device that comes from the sort of the toolkit, if you like, or the sort of pantheon of different cultural responses, different ways in which people can choose to structure the cemetery. They're still making the same divisions, saying this group of people are different to this group of people. Doesn't matter how they're doing that. And that sort of highlights that each individual cemetery is its own story, its own unique thing. We can't, as archaeologists, have one overriding idea and apply that to all sites. We have to try and understand them from a site-specific level. So that's sort of setting that up, really. And then the next chapter has to deal with the chronology, because, well, are these different groups just chronologically separated, or are they contemporary? And that matters quite a lot. And there are examples of both. So if I can show you another slide to help illustrate that, I think I should probably do. I can find a series of slides to illustrate this point. With my computer slowed down. Did I freeze there for a second?
No, you're right. It might be the recording might be.
Technology. Right, it should be shared now, so you should be able to see this.
Yeah, there is.
Okay, so that's Deal in Mill Hill, or Mill Hill in Deal, which is in Kent. And it's a Kentish cemetery, so there's loads of objects, so we can see the chronology really nicely, and we understand the Kentish chronology probably better than we do any other region because of its direct parallels with Merovingian material culture. And Beata Bugman has produced a really good sequence here that we can look at and see divisions where there are sort of breakaways in styles of objects. So you can see very clear differences. Now, what I do in this book and in previous publications is to start to think about how those chronologies work socially. So chronology in sort of more in meter chapter, I'd be thinking of these two clusters here, so burials to the north and south of this barrow, A and B, as spatially distinct, which I've established in the first chapter. And they're chronologically comparable. So deliberately trying to separate two groups that are contemporary and bury their dead separately in those spaces. And what's interesting is that those groups have slightly different material culture in them. So in the north group, we've got more fire steels. In the south group, we've got more pins and girdle hangers. So there seems to be a slightly different tradition taking place in each burial. And then this group C to the east here is chronologically separated. So these first two are 5th and 6th century, early and middle 6th century, and this later group here are later 6th and 7th century. And they have more weapons and some girdle hangers as well. So they're also distinct from these materially. So we've got the so what I'm trying to say here, I think, is that there are, we've got the example of clusters of burials that are both contemporary and separate. So you've got a change that takes place at some point in the late 6th century to a different style of burial, but at the same time we've got those contemporary things. And so we need to understand the chronology in great detail to be able to see exactly what's taking place at a local level. And really, I like to be able to take that right down to social time, generations, what exactly, how that change is happening. A young woman buried by her parents might be buried in a contemporary style, whereas an old woman buried by her children would be buried to a contemporary style to her children, not necessarily one that she would have been worn when she was a child. So if those two women were born at the same time, they would be buried with very different things, and potentially in this case in very different places in the cemetery. And so it's that sort of local history that I think really helps to elucidate some of the ideas or some of the patterns that we can see in these sites. And that breakaway in the late 6th and 7th century corresponds to an increase in the prevalence of weapon burials, therefore of a sort of masculinity in its prevalence within the mortuary ritual, and at the same time wealthier individuals. So whereas in those first ones, A and B, a single individual from each generation has high status goods, or a greater assemblage, greater wealth in their burial, a greater number of individuals in the status sixth and seventh. And so we're looking probably at a change in the way that individuality is expressed within the sites, the association between that group, that cluster. And that's quite interesting because that's a generational change, I argue. So the chronology chapter then is starting to really try and get right down into that sort of that level of detail. I go into probably quite painful detail about sites like Dover Buckland to try and understand the different clusters and the different speeds at which that change is happening, because I think this is very localized if we consider that a group of people are choosing to bury their dead in one of these clusters or another. They have localized traditions, hence they have different types of material culture that they're putting into the graves, different ways of dressing the dead, which are maybe family traditions. And they're also changing those attitudes at different speeds according to who's alive, how long someone remains in charge of that. If people die very quickly and the generations move over very quickly, perhaps change is rapid. Whereas if people live much longer and they resist those changes that are taking place around them, then those things take place much more slowly. And you can see those changes taking place in the individual plots at somewhere like Dover Buckland, which is extremely complicated and quite a big cemetery. So that's cool. And one of the things you can definitely see there are some plots that are short-lived and some plots that are much longer lived, and perhaps they relate to sites where you have a sort of community that lasts a long time, is very successful, versus one which is an idea that comes into practice and then for some reason the idea breaks down, the community dissipates or dies out, and so it comes to an end. Or you have that sort of rejection in the late 6th century. New plots, new burial styles start to appear. And at Dover in the late 6th century, a big, wide distributed spread of burials starts to appear across the north of the site. So we move away from these tight clusters, as we see it at Mill Hill, to a sort of scatter of burials across the whole site, some of them very wealthy indeed. So again, a completely different attitude taking place there and towards the burials, but still associated with those early ones, still using the identity and the story, the narrative that's associated with Deal or with Dover to tell the story of the individuals in those graves. So that's quite important, and that's what I'm trying to get to with the second chapter, is really looking at those local histories. In the third chapter, I just have to look up, is the grammar of graves themselves. That's when we start talking about material culture. That's when we start talking about what's in the graves, I believe. Get right down into those sort of chronological details, the sort of wealth. There you go. The sort of wealth of individuals, the gender of individuals. Look at infants versus adults and where they're buried. And if I have a quick skip through this, I can illustrate that quite neatly as well. I just did there with Deal talk a little bit about chronology. If we if we share screen again on, okay, so if I share screen again on this one, which is Wakeley in Northamptonshire, I've illustrated in this example where all the different objects are in the site, or sort of highlighted very specific objects in the site. And this one shows brooches, and the one preceding it, which is, going it to work, skip too fast. Right, this one shows buckles. And what's fascinating about this particular site is that you can see in this cluster here to the west of the cemetery, we have more type 2 buckles. So these are the ones with back plates. Okay, and then if I've gone to, yeah, okay. And in these two groups here, we can see the groups from the spatial statistics that developed early on in the book to look at the way the distributions work. There are fewer of those backplates here and here. Okay. Now, exactly the same thing with brooches. It's not necessarily about the type of brooch, but about their quantity, if you like, and the sort of the wealth that comes with that. So, for example, this Western group of burials here, which had the Type 2 backplates, has got the largest number of big gilt brooches. Okay, and it's got more individuals with two or more, up to 3 brooches, the big sort of cloak brooch and the two holding the clothing together. Whereas in these two groups of burials here and here, there's often a single larger brooch, here or here, for example, and then small numbers of smaller, less elaborate objects. So for the Western burial, rather than sort of focusing on status, what we should probably think about is that what was important to them was the sort of aesthetics of display. So they're much more dressed up than in the other burials. We don't really know what the wealth of these individuals was. We can count grave goods and we can look at gilt or silver or things like that. But in reality, it's that aesthetic that I think is important, because what it suggests is that this Western cluster had a different attitude towards burying their dead than the other two groups. And that's the theme that starts to come across at this point in the book, this idea that there are different attitudes towards the individuals displayed within there that can be seen at that group level. We can see some patterns as well. So this is Pol Hill in Kent, and you can see down at the bottom here we've got individuals with more male gendered grave goods, masculine objects, down in the south of the site. In fact, if you look at the skeletal archaeology, individuals are equally distributed throughout. So the fact that we've got a specific cluster down here suggests to those individuals who are choosing to bury their dead in area A were deliberately separating that sort of gender identity within that space. And that's interesting, because for a long time people have been looking for gender-specific patterns in Anglo-Saxon cemeteries or any archaeological cemeteries, because they're quite an interesting indicator into gender identity. And what we can see in this site and in multiple sites really is that there are patterns, but they are specific to individual clusters of burials, individual plots of burials. And so again, they are associated with this sort of attitude, this aesthetic, this narrative that individual group within a broader community have to explain. And one of the things I want to explore in the book, or explore in the book a little bit more, is that it's perhaps having that attitude where men are buried in a particular way and women are buried in a particular way and they're buried in a particular place is more akin to that sort of core elite Anglo-Saxon family than having less interest in those specific details. So that narrative is absolutely key to how they're choosing to bury the dead. And it's key to how that family is transmitting its identity at the mortuary ritual. Whereas other groups within that community don't have any investment in that story or in their own stories to exactly the same degree. So perhaps it's the attitude that tells us about status rather than the objects or the positions of burials. So that's where we're starting to see that sort of narrative develop. It's where the direction the book is going in by the time we hit chapter 3. And then in chapter 5, we start talking about the individual. So that's the point where we can start talking about the skeletal materials. I'm cheating slightly with that one because I talk about the individual, but in reality, I end up having to talk about community, because I don't think that individuality is such a significant problem in the early Middle Ages. But the question is about community. Okay, so if we to this sort of thing, we can see Right, so I'll share screen again. Can you actually, am I sharing screen or not?
Yeah.
I'm still sharing screen. Brilliant. Okay, so this is a really good way of illustrating this point, and this is the point that I drew out in the first chapter actually, but it illustrates the purpose of this, the chapter on individuality. So this is Apple Down. And Apple Down has multiple different types of inhumation. East-west inhumations, which in this illustration here are dark grey, and north-south inhumations, which in this illustration are light grey. And then a series of cremations all the way around the burial. And those ones I've applied spatial statistics to in this illustration to show that they sort of cluster on either side of the east-west orientated burials. So they're in fact two different spatially distinct groups of cremations on the left and the right hand side that surround that central group of core burials that are interred east-west, just like the north-south burials. So sort of an interesting variation in the mortuary ritual. We can see very clearly that east-west orientation when I highlight them red here, and you can see how that works within the space. So they're very, very aesthetically obvious when you do that, and presumably they would have been when you actually within the physical space as well. We have a very unique perspective, don't we, as archaeologists, because we're looking down at them from a map rather than walking through that space. But you can see from this they're clearly designed to be separate, to look and feel different. These groups of burials to the west here are almost certainly later, so a slight rejection of that in the 7th or 8th century as a mode of burial to create little lines. So that's the illustration from before, previously. Now, what's interesting is we can look at the material culture differently, just as I illustrated with the previous discussion. So in this case, at Apple Down, I defined it as configuration A and configuration B, the types of material culture going into the graves. Configuration A includes all of this range of things that we associate very directly with Anglo-Saxon mortuary rituals. So spears and shields and buckles and brooches and knives and buckets and that sort of stuff. Okay, belt hangers and things like that. Configuration B contains similar objects, but with less of that ascription to them. So knives and beads, buckles, the occasional small spear, but not very common at all. And so the way that people are choosing to decorate their dead in configuration B is very different to in configuration A. And this is how that works. So on the left-hand side, I've got illustrated the objects in each of the graves in configuration A. And you can see that corresponds very neatly with our east-west orientation. So the burials with that association are east-west orientated, and the vast majority of them are in the central area of the cemetery. The burials with that configuration B are the north-south burials with the lesser objects. You can see some individuals with weapons around the peripheries of the site, small weapons, small spears, but they have less objects, smaller objects. Objects are less common in those graves. So there's a clear difference in the way that people are choosing to dress their dead when they're going into the grave as well, which is really cool. So we can start building the sort of multiple layers onto it. So then if we think about multiple weapons, so thinking about male burials, though specifically in this case study, multiple weapons as opposed to individual weapons, we can see right in the center of the burial, some east-west, some north-south, we've got the wealthiest male burials that define the central space right in the center of the cemetery. A single one right on the edge. And perhaps there's a reason why that person was deliberately buried away from the rest, physically away from the rest, but on the same orientation, which contrasts to the rest of the burials in this space. So maybe we can start to tear out or draw out individual stories here by comparing differences and similarities in that way. Children are the yellow ones on this illustration. So I've got the multiple weapons you can I highlighted before in red, and the children. And I think children for this site particularly really helped illustrate the significance of this central area, because we've got those 3 wealthy burials, which date at slightly different times, generations in the cemetery. You've got an overbearance of aesthetically more furnished burials, and then the majority of the children and infants are buried in the same space. So people are continually returning to that space over time to bury individuals that are associated with that core group, that identity group. Perhaps because the children, it suggests family, perhaps. So the chapter on individuality then is trying to draw on skeletal materials, try to draw out some of these sorts of narratives. And one thing that I spotted while doing the analysis of Apple Down, which we'll go into detail about in there, is the skeletal trauma is different between configuration A and configuration B burials. So the north-south individuals in the middle have less skeletal trauma, despite living longer than those individuals, configuration B individuals, buried around the peripheries of the site. And that's quite fun. They live, well, it's not fun for them. They live shorter lives, but suffer more damage to their bones and to their bodies.
Isn't it?
So
To be associated with age.
You think that people pick up more trauma over age, over longer lives, but perhaps the point is that they live different lives, and that's really what I wanted to use skeletal trauma to do in this, because the problem with studying skeletal trauma is that it's different. Individuals live different lives and they have different things happen to them. So it's very difficult to say, well, there's 15 broken bones in this part of the cemetery and none in this part of the cemetery. It's actually a whole different range of things, like swollen ends of bones or breakages or osteoarthritis or periostitis, and when you apply all of that, you can see that sort of the higher risk of damage to their skeletal frame, which presumably implies the same thing for the flesh as well. So perhaps then this attitude that configuration A and B had comes in part from different experiences of life that they had as well.
They also have greater muscle mass as well than configuration B.
Yeah, exactly. This is something that Cherison spots in her master's dissertation, which was done quite a long time ago, 2000. But she did a really neat, she went on to do PhD in Anglo-Saxon archaeology and then write books on post-medieval burial practice, which are all very useful. And in her master's dissertation, what Anna spots is that the individuals who loosely conform to my configuration B group have larger muscle mass than those from the weapons individuals in the configuration A, who are more likely to have weapons. And I think that's quite interesting. She was looking for practice, weapon practice, to see if she could see, do men with weapons show signs of particular types of ligament attachments, higher density, that sort of stuff, more elaborate or more prominent markers on the bone, which could suggest practice, which could suggest repeated motions, which might be able to talk about combat. In fact, the physical size of these individuals was slighter than the individuals without. So perhaps again, this is an attitude thing. I mean, maybe weapon practice isn't actually what this highlights. Maybe it's labour, in the same way that lifeways and trauma suggests a different type of approach to work. Perhaps muscle mass also suggests the same thing. But more importantly, it also creates a different look, a different aesthetic. The human being, the physical form of that human being who's associated with the configuration B burial would have looked different to configuration A, even if it was only quite subtle. But that is quite meaningful, I think, when you're trying to interpret social differences and the way that people move, the way they hold themselves, the work they do, the physical frame itself looks different according to the attitude that you have within life, not just towards your dead. So that was where we start to have to make that move into the stories about the individual. And there's a few cases where we can start to do that in a lot more detail. one of the things I draw out in the book, which I don't have any slides to illustrate, is trying to look at height, stature as well. And what's interesting is in several sites there are similarities in height, really close similarities. So, you've got 7 or 8 weapon burials at a site like West Hazleton, and the weapon burials in plot A. I've got West Hazleton somewhere around here. There we go. So you should now.
Yeah, there we are.
See a neat illustration of West Hazleton in Yorkshire. Now, unfortunately, the book is printed in black and white, so the colour is here for this exercise and for presentations, which works nicely. And what this shows is, well, what I was talking about is stature. So what's really interesting is you've got a whole load of weapon burials here, and those ones are highlighted in red on this illustration. And then if they've got multiple weapons, they're in red, just as they were up or down. If they've got single weapons, and they're yellow. So you can see the yellow graves around here, with just single spear in and distributed around here. The statistics point to there being 4 classes of burials: this group here, this group here, this group here, and this group here, A, B, C, and D. Okay. What's interesting is that there's this sort of T-shape of very wealthy burials, or multiple weapon burials, I should say, aesthetically multiple weapon burials in cluster A, that right in the centre of it. And that's quite cool. Now, when you look at the stature, group A have male weapon burials, which includes all of the weapons, these yellow ones as well, who are much closer together, within a range of 2 centimetres than the other weapon burials in clusters B, C, and D. Now, stature comes from multiple different pathways. So diet is a very significant part of how tall and broad you are, how tall you are in particular. But also is your relationship to your parents. And if people are siblings, they are more likely to be of similar height than they are if they're not siblings. And so in the book we talk about this and sort of support this approach. And you can see, families today, you look at families, if one person is tall, they all tend to be tall. And so it's a sort of a way of trying to think about variation. The one thing I don't do in the book is look at individuals and say this person is the same height as this person, therefore they must be related. Because I don't think you can do that with that kind of data. You could do that with DNA data, and potentially you could do that with teeth metrics, because you can get very clear associations of individuals with teeth metrics. But with stature data, I think what we can tell is that there are more individuals more close or more similar to each other amongst the males in A than there are other places. So they're more likely to be people who are related in the male group in cluster A. Okay. And what's interesting about that is the women generally have much less similarity than the men. And when they do, it's not women with objects that are most similar, it's women without objects. Okay, so you've got this sort of attitude again, that perhaps we can see a little bit of male residence.
Sort of matrilocal kind of.
Exactly, matrilocality. So we've got this sort of elite male family where the man stays and he marries and the wife moves to him and they have children. And then the next generation, the son takes over and the woman moves and they have children. And thus you see this sort of similarity in height amongst male weapon burials, that sort of attitude approach. You don't see that amongst the women, the more elaborately buried females, because they're all coming in from different places. Okay. Whereas you do see that amongst the lower status women, perhaps amongst these different communities, those, for example, in areas C or D, in these different groups, in these different groups, it's the sort of less aesthetically wealthy individuals females are remaining present, perhaps because they're at work. Okay, so perhaps they're associated in some way with this core household, with this different group, and so they may not be marrying, or men may be coming in and marrying into those lower groups. So we might be able to start saying there are different attitudes towards gender mobility in different sort of cultural responses to individual burial practice in different spaces, in different life ways. And I think we can start to sort of put that invitation onto the body in this way, to start saying, well, these groups from these parts of the cemetery had a different approach to life than these people, by using all these types of different data. So it's not just about pathology, it's also about stature. I do talk about teeth metrics, although that's Alison Stewart's PhD project, so that go into huge detail in this book. But one thing that she has really definitely been able to spot is this sort of similarity amongst male weapon burials among tooth metrics. And the other group that she's noticed that tend to be quite similar to those are women up to a certain age. So you could have, for example, young women in group A under the age of 20, maybe 25. If you're looking at skeletal archaeology, you can't quite be so precise. Tend to be similar in their tooth metrics. And then all the older women are different. So perhaps we can see the sort of the point at which, if a woman dies when she's still at home, she's buried there. But if she marries out, she's buried in that local community. So we're seeing the sort of pre-married maidens who are dying before marriage in the site as well. So you actually start to see patterns according to age, which is really, really nice to start to have that coming out in Ali's thesis. And it really annexes on to the back end of this project really nicely. She's submitting that in a few weeks. So good luck to Ali for her PhD Viva, which will take her someplace in spring or early summer. Just while we've got it up, West Hazleton is quite neat in that we've in illustrating those attitudes, particularly in relation to male identity. As I mentioned, we've got this T shape right in the centre of cluster A here, which is buried adjacent to this massive Bronze Age barrow. Just to the west of that, we've got this little barrow and a smaller cluster. And right in the middle of that is burial 77, which I've illustrated blue here. And everybody else, if you look at them, they seem to sort of envelope around it really neatly. So you can imagine that there was probably a small mound over the top of that, and those burials have been placed in sequence around that mound. But 77 hasn't got weapons in it at all. It's got a whetstone and a pair of tongs, and a pot. So artifacts that are more associated with metalworking than with that sort of martial masculinity that we can see in the multiple generations of male burials in the centre of A. So that suggests to me that West Hazleton here has got one core wealthy Anglo-Saxon family, and then lots and lots of different communities associated with that are supporting them. So we've got a sort of secondary household of a smith supporting the elite group here, perhaps associated more with labour, with work, with manufacturing, weapon making or other metal making, that sort of stuff. And then these sort of more ancillary groups, which are distributed widely across the northern part of the cemetery in plots D and C. Although some of the burials are reasonably wealthy comparatively, they don't have that sort of core attitude that we see everywhere else. And so perhaps they are, ancillary families within this community. So communities then consist of multiple different households, multiple different family groups, individuals with different roles. Perhaps we've got, unmarried women, sisters, daughters. We've got young children. We've got teenage boys with weapons. We've got, a man and his brothers who are the core group, who are marrying women from outside and having children, forming that sort of elite family, and then a broader sort of economic base for a whole spectrum of different communities around it. And of course, West Hazleton's nice because there is a settlement. And the settlement is quite complicated in its layout, and it has a different manufacturing space or technical space to the lived space as well. And so it'd be really neat to compare them. Yeah, so I think we can start seeing the same sorts of stories taking place in the lived settlement as in the burial space as well, which is quite neat. It's quite nice to be able to do that.
Yeah.